And we're on.
Okay. Welcome to the Tenfold AI podcast. I'm Heather, joined by Matt. We're the co-founders of a company called Promode.ai, which is also the sponsor of this podcast. Promode.ai is an AI-powered marketing engine specifically built for B2B companies to do content marketing, SEO, mass communications of your message, highly custom, unique, using enterprise level AI processes. Nothing like it on the market yet. And we just like talking about AI. Hi, Matt. How you doing?
Excellent. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good. And I'm very excited for this conversation today because I was thinking about, the podcasts we've done so far and the conversations I have about AI with business owners, and one of our goals of even doing this podcast is helping business owners make good decisions in AI, avoiding things like shiny object syndrome, getting overwhelmed and trying out little tools here and there, but nothing that actually makes a measurable difference in their business. At the end of the day, they're wasting time, wasting money, and probably the biggest, uh, you know, danger in that is they're missing the actual AI opportunity that exists. So, in thinking about what we've talked about so far on our podcast, kind of comparing that with conversations I'm having out in the wild, it kind of, I guess, dawned on me that there's some real fundamentals, like 101 questions that I think are lingering in the minds of business owners. Just how do they understand what AI is? And the reason it's so important to understand what it is and to go through some of these questions I'm going to drill you with today, and so stoked to hear your answers and even challenge some of those until I reach the point of full understanding and our listeners can join along. But the reason for that is the better you understand what it is, I think the more you know what to expect it to do for you, right? Like it's not magic, it's not nothing, but it's not magic, right? So where does it live in the realm of reality? That's not clickbait, that's not investor bait, right? That's real world. What are the components of this thing so that I can know what I can expect it to do for me today?
Yo, you accidentally trademarked so many great things. I just want to say that venture bait, you said
Venture bait.
investor bait, venture bait, I think is a great term. Trademark that. Is this legally binding?
Well, you've totally opened my eyes to that world. I had no frame of reference for the venture capital world, for software startup world. I came from marketing agencies, right? Where it's very much human capital, not software capital that you're, hanging your hat on. And you've really educated me a lot on that, like that not everything you hear in the news about tech is real, that so much of it is for the purpose of driving up stock prices and encouraging investors, and which makes complete sense from a like positioning standpoint. You want to be bigger than you are. And I think comes with a lot of disservice to consumers, when they're afraid of AI or, feel overwhelmed navigating AI. Well, no wonder when people like Elon Musk are saying every car is going to be a self-driving car in 10 years.
hmm
And I
hmm
was like, wait a minute. Huh? Do you see how many cars are on the road today? Like the logical mind doesn't compute because it isn't logical. But if you own a company or a set of companies that, have shareholders and stock value, like obviously you want to make the future your company.
Yes. And if you are not a publicly traded company and you are a venture-backed startup, your goal is to create as much demand for your next fundraising round. And
Right.
so it is, and to think like, I mean, you worked in marketing. What are you going to do if you are trying to get 10 venture funds to jump on your next round, you're going to create demand. And with that demand comes a lot of bending of the truth.
Right. Well, and it's not just pumping up your shiny object or your mousetrap, right? It's also making everything else seem obsolete,
Mhm.
which leads to fear like these robots are going to take all the jobs. And that is a scary thought. Like, no matter where you are in life, that's a scary thought. If you have kids, if you have a job, if you live in a society, it's just a scary thought to think of what the domino effect might be if robots take all the jobs. But it's like, who is saying that? And what do they have to gain by you believing that?
Exactly. Percent.
Yeah.
I think my worst fear is that a business owner would maybe have or anybody really would have a perception of AI from these types of sources and then attempt to use it in some capacity and either be disappointed in it and ignore it until they can't anymore, um, or just be so preoccupied by it that every new viral tool that is out there, they're signing up for, and really no actual problems are ever solved
Right.
in either of those scenarios.
Yeah, you've definitely pointed out several of those to me. And I just want to add before I ask question number one, I think this conversation is especially poignant today because of what happened yesterday in the stock market. Something like $2 trillion vanished from the stock market because of tariffs and all the things. And we're not here to, make political statements or guesses, but I think that the reality is, I think more business owners will be keen on AI today than they were yesterday, simply because they are wondering, maybe clamoring for how do we recover margins? How do we stay afloat? How do we stay relevant in light of, these hindrances put upon them by, new regulations, changing stock conditions, all of those things.
Hmm. Hmm.
Do you anticipate an increased interest in adopting AI?
Absolutely. I mean, like, while the stock market really isn't any indicator of the health of the economy, it sure is an indicator of the sentiment of the economy. And
Mm.
that is going to be that's going to be something that, especially as the market has been so overpriced for the last, I was actually pretty ecstatic yesterday. I'm hopefully digging out of this hole of this short position that I've had on the S&P for the last few years. So I was wondering when that shoe was going to drop. Good Lord.
Yeah.
But
Well, to segue into the first question, if you can fully make me understand AI, and I have a better understanding than most, but I don't feel like I have a deep working understanding. I don't think I could explain it to a 10-year-old,
Mhm,
right? Which to me is like the litmus test. Like, if you can make my 12-year-old daughter understand what AI is really, then you are a ninja level expert,
mhm.
in my opinion, anyway. But before I, dive into the first question, if you can make me fully understand AI, your next assignment will be to make me understand Bitcoin. Because I've always heard never invest in something you don't understand. And I played around with some Bitcoin several years ago. Wish I kept it, didn't. But because I didn't understand it, I'm like, but where does the money go? Like, if I give you the money, who takes the money? I can sort of understand mining for data to arrive at what, like, I can kind of wrap my head around that. But the roadblock I always had was, where does the cash go? And I'm like, this is a giant Ponzi scheme and it's gonna pop one day. But anyway, that'll be for another day. You can explain that to me on or off a podcast.
Crypto is a great analogy. I think that other people might know. When you were talking about the hype around AI, I think crypto is a perfect example of that, where there are legitimate use cases. A lot of it is bullshit.
Right. And I think it was easier to dismiss it as kind of fugazi because the only thing that was real that seemed to change was the value, which seemed imaginary and very risky, right? But in the world of AI, we can see actual outputs that are actually valuable.
Mhm.
So there's kind of more obvious proof of its existence than in the world of Bitcoin, to me
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. Well, that should be a future episode. We should talk about blockchain's role in AI. That would be a very
Totally.
fun one to talk about.
Yeah, and you touched on that the other day in regard to, oh, we were talking about real estate transactions, and you used the word blockchain plus AI, and I kind of put that on a shelf of don't know what he's talking about, but let's get back to it another day. Okay, so I sent you 5 rudimentary 101 questions. What number would you like to start with?
I think it
Because
would
to me,
be,
those are all in the same bucket, but maybe one is an entry point for you to somewhere else.
I think the question related to what is a large language model and how does ChatGPT work? I think that will be, as we start to unpack what is AI broadly, I think using something like Gemini or ChatGPT, Claude, any of these things, it's a familiar interface for people. And so I think that that's a really good place to start.
Okay. So, what is an LLM? What is a large language model?
A good way to think of an LLM, large language model, is like a calculator for words and letters. Okay. Um, so you can imagine if you had every book that has ever been written in the world, you could imagine that if you were able to put all of those letters into a calculator, you would begin to learn that there are certain patterns where X percent of the time, a certain percentage of the time, one letter follows the next letter, right?
Hmm. So, kind of like predictive text in our phones where we're texting and boom, the word pops up. You're probably going to say, go to the store, farm,
Exactly.
doctor. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. You hit the nail on the head with that. So similar to and kind of similar to how numbers work. If you think about prime numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, there's a pattern that these numbers follow. And, we can memorize the prime numbers. And if you recall in school, you would, list them out, like list all the prime numbers you can until you don't know anymore.
Hmm.
But then you can imagine that if you understood what a prime number meant, you could then look at any number and determine, is this in fact a prime number? If you understood that, a prime number is just can't be divisible by anything.
Yeah. That's kind of the difference between like rote memorization and understanding.
Exactly. Exactly. So I've got a couple visual aids here to maybe we're going to talk a little bit about how are these things trained?
I do love a visual.
Yeah. I was having fun with these. Okay. So this is like a little passage from, I think it's Cat in the Hat. So the highlighted, like, just so you're aware, these are just randomly highlighted text. They don't actually mean anything, but it's just a visual aid of how this thing works. So you see here, there is a T and an H right here. The likely next letter to follow might be an E. X percent of the time, E follows a T and an H. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, Similar to like DID. So when they're training a large language model, when it's built and it does its initial building phase, it is reading through, I mean, billions and billions of pages of text like this. And then it begins to form a model of understanding that in this library of text that I am reading, I'm speaking as a large language model now. This library of text that I'm reading, there are patterns that begin to emerge. And then after that initial model is built, there is then a process of post-training that occurs. And this is oftentimes, it's done in a lot of different ways. There's something called human reinforcement learning. Okay. So in the case of human reinforcement learning, you'll have a human that will be in a chat interface that looks like a very rudimentary chat GPT, and it will just kind of start asking questions or putting prompts into it and seeing what comes out. Now, one thing that might emerge is the model may actually start speaking like Dr. Seuss, as we see here. Okay. And then as the model, let's say, starts to talk like Dr. Seuss, that human that is interacting with it will then give it instructions that actually the text that you're giving me, while accurate in the letter predictions, this is actually this is a poem. This is prose. So, unless you are text that looks like this is poetry. So put this in a category in your brain of poetry, of rhyming schemes. And so that, that all of the letter combinations and all of the probabilities inside of that large language model will get reconfigured, and it will take this Dr. Seuss passage and put it into a poetry category. Once this passage has been put over in poetry, there may be a subcategory of poetry that is Dr. Seuss. And so then it will begin to learn that Dr. Seuss, like poetry, has this type of pattern associated with it.
So is an AI model the same thing as a large language model, or are those two separate things?
AI is a big umbrella category. So underneath AI as a category, you have things like robotics, large language models, machine learning. So large language model is a subcategory of AI. So I don't think that to actually say something, to say the term AI model might not be 100% accurate. You would say a large language model or a machine learning model or a self-driving model. These are all categories within the broader artificial intelligence umbrella.
Okay, and so they are delineated by what they're trained to do.
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Okay. And so at some point, so I'm just imagining like the human part of the process where you said what did you call it? The
A reinforcement learning.
human reinforcement learning. What rule book are they following? Or like how do they know what list of things to train that model for something as general as ChatGPT or OpenAI?
Yeah, this is
Like, what's their list of, okay, we're going to do poetry. We're going to do like, how do they arrive at that list?
this to me is probably one of the most fascinating parts of the technology is that you put a human in there. That's actually what gives these models their personality. By and large, if you are, for the purposes of this discussion, let's just keep everything within the English language. Because obviously
Okay,
you can build,
easy.
yeah, so these things can be built in all kinds of languages. You could build a large language model on emojis, even. So the possibilities are vast with what you train this on. But we'll stick with English language text for the sake of this. Now, yeah, so this is really where the art of these large language models comes in is if you are the model creator, what type of human interaction or like how do you want the humans to shape this model for the next humans to use? And that there is a tremendous amount of variation on that piece. So to think about it like a cake, by and large, every large language model out there, the cake is baked. I mean, maybe 5 to 10% different from one another, right? The process is pretty standard and it has been for a long time. Is what is the art of decorating that cake is the human reinforcement, the post training of the model. So, for example, there one thing that is happening all of the time is there might be so you first train the model on a big library of text. And let's say you start to do some human reinforcement learning. I'm gonna stop sharing this so everybody doesn't have to look at this. We'll come back. Let's say that in that initial library of text that you use to train that large language model, there isn't a ton of information about watchmaking. For example, I just looked at a watch on my desk. There probably is, but let's pretend that there's not a lot of information on watchmaking. And so, generally as you're going through this process of reinforcement learning, there are thousands of offshore workers that are talking to these things. They're given, uh, you know, a, a task sheet, talk to this model about all of these topics and just make any notes of any anomalies in here. And so let's say in that process, somebody receives watchmaking. And so they start asking this model about watchmaking and they realize that there was a big gap in our training data. We tried to reorganize the way all of the words exist in the model, and they say, you know what, we just don't have enough words about watchmaking. In that case, what they'll actually do is then bring in expert watchmakers to write papers on watchmaking and processes on it. So there is an element of in the source text that the model was initially trained on when that cake was initially baked. If there wasn't enough information about something, or let's say they wanted it to be hyper specialized in one area, they'll actually bring in experts to then, old school writing a college paper and then feeding that into the model.
So, how often does that happen? I mean, you might not know the exact answer, but it seems like the body of human knowledge is pretty well documented somewhere already, but that's not the case.
Well, there may be instances in which you can't get that knowledge or, so let's say that let's say that like the International Watchmakers Association has locked up all of their secrets about watchmaking and they're unwilling to grant access to this library to the makers of large language models.
Hmm.
In those instances, the creator of that large language model will say, okay, well, if you're not going to give it to us, we are going to go hire, we're going to go pay 100 expert journeyman watchmakers to write papers, and we're going to pay them a shitload of money to do it. And they're going to write papers manually based off of their expertise. And then we are going to put that into our model. How often that happens, I'm not really sure. I'm not, it does happen. I think more often than not, bringing in the human experts to sort of manually check in on things is typically done in a supervisory role. So this would be human supervised reinforcement learning. And so this is where you have a panel of experts who come in and really grill the machine on a niche topic that they know really well.
So, it's not the case that large language models can be trained on everything because there's rules about like there's intellectual property and copyright. So, are most large language models that we have access to as the public are trained on open source data? Is that correct? Unless it's like Gemini and they own the Google search data, or Grok, who owns the Twitter data, and then they can be trained on that owned data. But it's not like ChatGPT can be trained on every, you know, piece of writing that ever was, because they don't own the rights to that. Or that's supposed to be the rules, right?
Correct. And this is where now we're kind of getting into a territory of um, how are these models used? What are they good at and what are they not good at? So I have another visual aid here. So let's talk about this. All right. So if we think about so so we talked up here. Now here's the same thing with Shakespeare. So we talked about when you're doing this when the first training is done on the model, you're putting like a ton of computing power. Like everybody's heard of NVIDIA and these chips and these processors and transformers. Basically, what that is you have a computer the size of an Amazon warehouse that is just going through letters and coming up with probability that one letter follows the next. Okay. That's the first run. And so after you do that, what happens is that there are these clusters of associations inside of the model. So with a cluster of associations, we have the word pet is likely very closely associated with dog. Okay. And then pet in its association with dog can be a noun or a verb. And so then the model learns that pet is a noun or a verb when these other words and letters are around it. And so it just is kind of creating these relationships with those words. And then as you go deeper and deeper into the model, the word pet can be associated with dog or cat or rabbit. It can be a noun or a verb. The word pet can also be associated with your pet peeve or the teacher's pet. And if you enter over here on teachers, you could have teacher salary, teacher school, and then maybe you go through all of these associations and also arrive at teacher's pet. So the whole model is what it is very good at is learning those things, just how language works, how language is assembled, how words are then assembled into sentences, and then what concepts emerge out of chunks of words. Okay. Can we combine this chunk of words and have a concept, a single word concept attached to this chunk? And so that is a large language model being used as a calculator. Okay.
Okay. So back to the training part, real quick, the human training part. At some point, can the LLM, so it sounds like the LLM is a master pattern recognition expert, right? So those likelihood of this follows this is based on looking at millions of patterns. So is it possible then that the LLM can kind of zoom out, for lack of a better term, and rather than saying what word is likely to follow this word or what letter is likely to follow this letter, to zoom out far enough to say, if my model wants to be trained on this whole concept, then it's likely that my model wants to be trained on this other whole concept, and then actually train itself.
Yes, and that is sort of done. So that's done when the model is initially built, and that is also done during reinforcement learning. So, for example, well, let's use the teacher's pet example. So, let's say I just got this brand new model out of the box, and I just type in fill in the blank 100 times, and I type in teachers. Okay. And so then it will finish, just create sentences, 100 sentences off of that. And then let's say that one of the terms that, or one of the sentences that it comes up with is Heather is such a kiss ass. She's a real teacher's pet or something.
Probably. Yeah.
So then so then if, so then let's say I'm training this model and I zoom in on that sentence and that concept. Okay. So then what I can do is say, well, now let's expand on the concept of Heather being a teacher's pet. What does that mean? So then we begin to associate concepts with that. So the concepts that I might associate with that are maybe Heather gets good grades. And this is a derogatory term for kids who get good grades. It's a term that is often said out of jealousy for other kids. So then we're taking things like childhood jealousy. We're taking the concept that one kid getting good grades and another one not, and making fun of a kid for getting good grades. These are all connected concepts. So I, as the human that is doing this post training, I have to reinforce those particular concepts. The
Mm.
model is fully agnostic to the idea that a teacher's pet might be a derogatory term said out of jealousy because a kid gets good grades and I don't. Because the model is not going to inherently know that actually there is a subculture in America where getting good grades can be seen as a negative thing. Because the model will have all of this, it will have this huge corpus of data that is just shouting that good grades are a positive concept. And so then the human has to take that little chunk of that concept and say, well, here's this other concept called jealousy that you may have learned about in by reading Julius Caesar. I had a Julius Caesar excerpt in here. So do you recall all of these concepts of jealousy over here? Here is a line between the concept of jealousy, good grades, and teacher's pet. And so then it's just creating these associations. If you just think about lines intersecting through words or through letters first, and then words, and then the human comes in and kind of helps create these concept associations where we can actually go from Julius Caesar to jealousy to teacher's pet to dog. And you
Yeah.
can, okay, now we're going to make these connections.
Yeah. So I think this is where it's so helpful for people to understand this human part of AI because this is where it's demystified. I think tremendously, rather than it being this black box of, oh my God, how did it know that? And what's it going to do to my life? And like, because it can feel when you're using these AIs, the better you are at it, the more it can feel like this, that you're talking to something that has intent or that has an ethos. And when you understand how those LLMs are built and trained by humans, it starts to make sense. No, it's just using these associations that it has been trained to identify. So it's like when I think of the calculator analogy that you used, if I do my books with my calculator has no idea if $150 for my gas bill is a lot for a gas bill, is not a lot for a gas bill, where it fits into my budget, or any of the numbers in my budget. It doesn't know if my income is a lot or not a lot. Like it's just raw data into that calculator. But a CFO could look at that and say, here is how this paints an actual picture. And I so respect like good CFOs who can make numbers speak, because that's not a skill I have. I'm much more a word person than a number person. But with AI models trained on finances, for instance, trained to be CFOs in a way, right? That's where it connects. Like you're providing a frame of reference, context to that data and saying, if this data represents this piece of your budget, here is how this paints a whole picture. So it makes it make sense.
That, Heather, that is such a good analogy. Your calculator doesn't know if that's a high gas bill. That's the perfect example of this. And so, and a great segue to talking about there's another side to these large language models. So you would kind of ask the question of when would you bring in an expert to add very specific information into this model? So let's say there is a gap in this model related to cellular biology. Well, we'll have 100 of the top cellular biologists come in, check the thing's knowledge, rewrite incorrect information in this thing so that there is accurate data inside of it. So this is kind of the other half of a large language model. So there's the calculator part of it where it assembles letters into words, words into sentences, chunks of sentences into concepts, but it's still all prob probability associations between all of those things. That's the calculator side of it. Now, in your analogy, there is a little mini CFO inside of the large language models. So not only are they calculating the assembly of text, but there is factual data inside of that can be retrieved one way or another. It can be retrieved through an internet search. It can be retrieved through like Arvix is a peer-reviewed journal repository that is accessible to large language models. So you ask an LLM a question and it will go pull from some studies and present you with that factual information. Now, this is where the performance of a large language model becomes somewhat less impressive and somewhat unreliable. And that is because they are just much better at language and concept assembly than they are like factual retrieval.
Mm.
And that's just because it's two entirely different computing processes. So now I don't know if I like maybe jumped the shark on complexity with that. So I'm doing a little check-in.
I don't think so, but I feel like this is leading to like how to know, like, let's say a business owner, right? How to know which AI model to use.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of leads to, or like, what's the boots on the ground, real world use case for AI? And it seems like you're getting to, it depends on what the output needs to be. Is it purely assembling language or is it highly fact dependent, highly variable? Am I on the right track?
You hit the nail on the head. Yes, exactly. So if you are using AI to, like you said, if you need it to assemble language and assemble concepts and maybe even pull from a known trusted source of data and then to assemble that in a way that is digestible or usable, that is great for these like broad general models. So like your chat GPT or even a custom GPT or using the API to fine tune a GPT instance. If the idea is that you don't need to rely on it for factual output, you're not using it like you're not getting directions to a coffee shop from this thing. So that is one use case. It is a calculator, it is language assembly. Then if you are going to use AI for something like, okay, we mentioned cellular biology. So let's say you're using AI for protein folding. You want to do a study on a new drug or a new, yeah, protein folding is a great example because it's used constantly. In that instance, we don't need to know about teachers' pets or jealousy or any of these things. We actually want to shrink down the capabilities of this powerful computer, and we just want to make it laser focus in on protein folding.
Uh-huh.
And so then you would have a model in that post training that we were talking about. Every human that you have working on that post training is an expert in protein folding. And so they are just hammering that thing to ensure that it is fully accurate in its output because it has this specialized purpose. Now, those are such niche use cases. So, a use case for that might be in the legal profession, right? If you can, let's use prenuptial agreements for this use case. If you're going to have it draft a legal document, that is something that AI can do phenomenally. If you want it just to come up with a great prenuptial agreement, you probably want to use a model that was highly trained on generating this one type of legal document, because then it will have been trained on all of the potential scenarios, every potential clause that should be included in there. It will be able to quickly recognize if something important is missing from this document. And so it's just this hyper specialized thing that needs to work. So you kind of want to remove all of the unnecessary knowledge from this thing, and it just is like a hunting dog at that point. It's like you have one job, you need to go get this duck out of a pond.
It's like a really, really well-trained subject matter expert
Hmm.
on that thing. So is what you're describing, is that what we call an owned LLM?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, that would be in the case of protein folding, it probably is a lot of machine learning. I don't want to get too complicated with it here, but yes,
I
that would
just want
be.
people to know sort of the glossary of terms and, they're like where they fit into the whole puzzle. Because I think business owners are being approached by AI salespeople a lot. I don't mean robot salespeople, I mean humans selling AI solutions. And we're using a lot of jargon. And there needs to be some, working definition of what those terms mean so that the buyer can make sure that that's what it actually is, know that it's what they need, have a grid for it. So owned LLM, RAG model, AI, like these are terms I've heard in,
Mhm.
connected to different AI products. So is that kind of what you're describing, or would there be a better term for
Yeah.
that?
Okay. I think I've got a good framework for understanding this. Let's see if we can do this. Okay. So these things will kind of fall into three buckets here. One, two, three. Okay. So bucket number one, we're just going to call this GPT. So when I talked about how pet can be associated with dog, it can also be associated with teacher's pet. That can be associated with grades. That can be associated with being a suck up. That can also be associated with jealousy. Jealousy is associated to, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and all of these things are associated. It is just a broad concept engine. Then over here, I don't know the exact terminology for this. This would be like hyper specialized. I don't know. I'm going to go specialized. So this would actually be a large language model that specializes in something like protein folding, or not a large language, machine learning model, AI, whatever you want to call it. This would be just like a hyper specialized, hyper technical model that just has one output, and it dedicates all of its computing power, all of its tokens to that specialized output. there's this middle ground over here. Okay. So like pro mode falls into this middle ground where it is not this hyper specialized thing where you need to, the output is like protein folding, for example. But in the case of pro mode, it's in this middle ground. This middle ground is retrieval augmented generation. Now,
And could you, real quick, I think you could also assign dollar signs to 1, 2, 3. 1 would be $1 sign, 2 would be $2 signs, 3 would be $3 signs,
exactly. Yes, yes. 100%.
because you're getting more sophisticated in the setup process, more custom in the build of those. Okay.
Totally. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head. Yeah. And as far, and if we're, and to just get even more specific on dollar signs, category number 3, this has 3 commas. Category number 2 has
Mm,
1 comma. Category 1 has 0 commas with what you're going to be paying
brilliant.
for it.
Yep.
So just as a, yeah, to sort of frame that the cost of those. Yeah. So when we're talking about these hyper specialized models, you are needing to buy chips or rent chips. You have like, there's a rack in a data center with
Mm,
your name on it kind of situation. Now, and this is kind of the beautiful thing. I really am so bullish on this middle tier because what you get for what you pay is a remarkable value. So what's the benefit of number 3? The benefit of number 3 is that it knows everything about you. It is like if you are doing cellular biology for this particular, let's say Lyme's disease, this thing, it knows everything that there was ever to know about the project that you're working on. The benefit of this over here is that it is super cheap and it assembles language and concepts at a absolutely rapid pace. Now,
mm,
what if you need the benefits of number 1, that it can assemble a lot of different concepts very well. It can understand jealousy in the context of Shakespeare, and it can understand jealousy in the context of second graders who have bad grades and
mm,
really have a good grasp on both of those things. But then let's say you want to introduce some, let's say that you want to introduce some hyper specific information about your experience as a second grader and your grades. And if you were the teacher's pet or if somebody else was the teacher's pet, the benefit of this second model here is that you can actually create a little database that it kind of looks like the number 3 model here, but this is just your database.
mm,
And so with the retrieval augmented generation setup, what you can do is you can say, hey, we are going to talk about pets. Go into my database and find everything related to pets. And then I want you to take all of that information, put it in a format that this thing can read really well. And I want you to give more preference. You can override some of the things that you know about pets with this information right here. And so it's this middle ground where you kind of, in a really cost effective way, you don't need to spend $1 billion or $6 billion to build your own specialized large language model here, but you can extract data that is in the same format that is readable by these large language models and say, hey, now do your expert language assembly, but I want you to use my data here as the primary source of information when you assemble these concepts.
Love it. This is so cool. So if I'm researching, can you go back to that real
Yeah,
quick
absolutely.
so I can refer to it? If I'm a cancer research facility, I'm going to use number 3 for my R&D.
Mhm.
I'm going to use number 2 for my marketing to talk about cancer research.
Yeah,
And if I'm a high school student writing a paper on cancer, I'm going to use number 1.
exactly. 100%. Yep, you nailed it. You nailed it. Yep. So, yeah, in that example, you're doing R&D, you're processing millions and millions of cancer studies here in number 3, and then you could, I mean, theoretically, you could take the results of those studies and uh like what is interesting, what is promising. You could have a researcher who knows how to read the research, and then that researcher could say, "Hey, go ahead and upload these promising case studies over here, and then we want to do a press release of it. So go ahead and get 10 case studies related to this thing. Send those 10 case studies over here to this language assembly thing and make it understandable for a 10-year-old."
I love it. And this is why RAG is so brilliant for marketing. And it's why we use it in pro mode, because if you're a laser manufacturer, like one of our clients, right? It is really, really difficult to find humans who know how to write about what you do accurately and in your brand voice. And good luck using something like ChatGPT or any retail AI chat interface, because they simply are not trained on enough of your data of what makes you unique as a company, your processes, your products, what you're doing, who you do it for. There's not enough of that custom data, available to a ChatGPT to arrive at good outputs, which is why so many, I think, agencies and internal marketing departments within companies are struggling using AI, and they know it's not great. They're using Jasper, they're using Claude, they're using these things, and they're like, yeah, it reads okay. And we can kind of make it sound like our brand voice a little bit if we really hack it, but it's never getting smarter about us. And it's full of inaccuracies. It's nothing amazing that would really intrigue our prospects or our audience. So they know that AI is the key to saving money on marketing, on producing more content, on talking about themselves in a more frequent and better way. But the limitations of AI chat interfaces are just not talked about.
Hmm.
And the RAG model method is really the answer for that, to be cost efficient and really, really accurate and really, really good.
And I think,
And that's the plug of the day.
nice. Yeah. Well, and you had asked me, I think one of the questions, I don't know if it was for this episode or the next one that we're going to do, but you had asked me, should businesses be concerned about not adopting AI? And I think that, like, framed in terms of retrieval augmented generation, this is where I see all data storage going in the future. So you have these databases. We were talking about just using this in terms of marketing, but these databases can be like accounting, marketing, this could be HR. And so you can have all of this data inside of here. And the cool thing is that it can be in any format. You could just scan in your HR manual and you just let it, the AI who inserts this information, you let it know that, hey, this is an HR material. Go ahead and put that here. And then you would have an LLM over here that needs to we are hiring for this position. Well, then all of a sudden we have this AI accessible bit of data related to HR, and we can extract that little sliver and then use it wherever we want. So this can go out into an email, this gets posted on LinkedIn, this gets put onto your website, and it just gets filtered into all of these different formats that are usable anywhere, but they're stored in a way where concepts can be retrieved. And if you really think about most business data, let's use your CRM as an example. Like, you don't care so much about the email field in the CRM. You don't care. I mean, you kind of don't really even care about what is this prospect's name? What company do they work for? The thing that you care about is what does my pipeline look like? What is the concepts? What are the concepts inside of this CRM? And what can we do with it? Like, what can we do with these concepts? And so I think that just business technology in general will move to this place where AI becomes the computer, the assembly step, and these retrieval augmented generation databases become the repository of all of the data related to a company, related to a business. And then it's just stored in a format that is accessible by humans. So if like you want to report about this quarter's earnings, you just say, hey, give me a report on this quarter's earnings. And it goes in there and it translates that AI readable version of that into a beautiful report for your shareholders. Do that with marketing data, all of those things. Whereas if you really take a moment to think about how all of this existing data is stored today, it is clunky and expensive and not really usable on a concept level.
Mhm. And it's important to mention those databases that are talking to LLMs, those are insulated from the LLMs. So your data is kept private, is kept secure. You're simply encrypting questions, very, very long questions, to those LLMs to get the information that you want, but you're not exposing your owned data to an open source thing that's outside of your control that could be accessed by anybody else.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Very important. Well, this has been very cool. We talked about what is an LLM. I think we sort of arrived at how ChatGPT works in a roundabout way, which also applies to Grok and Claude and Jasper and the HubSpot content generation tools, right? So all of the retail AI chat interfaces that anyone can access, this is how they work. And this is how the LLM works and how it is built. This was kind of a rough and dirty, um, sprint understanding session. And I feel like I understand it a little better and can speak to it better. And I hope our listeners can as well. Um, so yeah, I really appreciate it. This has been the Tenfold AI podcast. I'm Heather. This is Matt. We're co founders of Promo.ai, the first ever marketing engine powered by AI built for B2B companies. Thanks. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.